Hello, my name is Joe Obidzinski, and I'm the Program Coordinator for History and Heritage here at WVU Jackson's Mill. Today, we're down here in our historic area in the Mountain State Building. This building we use as a programming space for a variety of different activities and programs throughout our year. Today, the first activity we're going to talk about is candle dipping. We know that 200 to 300 years ago, electricity was not here in this area. When the sun went down, we had to have other ways for us to be able to see. One of the most important was candles. Now, the difference between the modern candles that we have today and the candles that people made back then is that most of the time we get ours from the store, but the vast majority of people had to make their own. So what were they making them out of, and how did that process work? In this region, one of the most common things that they used was actually animal fat, if you can believe it. It was called tallow. Specifically, beef tallow was the ideal. And what this was a part of the animal fat. Now, when they would boil this fat, it would be what was called rendering. And it would actually separate into two different layers. One layer was called tallow. This was harder and it was more like wax. They would use string that they would have twisted together, and this would have been from any fibrous material, wool, cotton, anything that they had available to them. Now let's talk about some of the other types of candles, because of course I've mentioned beef tallow and most people would probably think, well, what about something like beeswax? Well, beeswax absolutely was around, and people definitely did use it. The problem with beeswax was that it wasn't always very readily available. It's also one of those things that if you're going to use lots of candles, it's going to take a while to get enough of that wax in order to be able to make lots of candles. Now, in all of these cases, you used what you had available, but most commonly in this region, it would have been tallow candles, at least until about the 1850s. And that's when we started getting oil out of the ground, and chemists started to realize that there was actually a byproduct of pulling out this oil. It was this white, waxy substance called paraffin. Now, paraffin is still the most common type of candles that we have today, even though this is slowly being replaced by things like soy and other things like that. Now, we have this idea that people who lived back then were constantly burning candles. But remember, that if you were only making candles about once per year, you wanted to make sure that your candles were going to last from one fall season to the next. So you burned them when you absolutely needed to. Now, there were generally three reasons why you would burn candles. You'd burn candles in the middle of the night if you needed to see what you were doing. The other thing was if you absolutely needed to do some work by candlelight that could not wait until natural light, like the sun being out. And the last would be on rare special occasions, things like Christmas and stuff like that. Most families would produce somewhere in the neighborhood of a few hundred to as many as 1,000 candles. It would depend on how much of that beef tallow you had and also how many people were in your family. The important thing was that they were doing this within the fall, so they needed to be able to cool the layers in between the dips. Every single time you dip a candle, you're putting a layer of wax on that candle wick. Once that happens, you need to let that layer cool enough before you dip again, or else you're going to take the wax right back off as you dip it back into that hot wax. You might think, my gosh, this would have taken days or weeks or even months to do. Well, people back then were very much of the mindset that you worked smarter, not harder. And one of the things that they would have utilized was something like this. This is a candle paddle, or at least a replica of one. And the idea behind this is that these hooks on the bottom would actually have candle wicks hanging from them. So you'd have, in this case, about a dozen hanging from the bottom of this candle paddle. A family might have a half dozen or even a dozen of these things. And so the idea was that you could dip multiple wicks at one time. You could allow that layer to cool as you hung it up someplace, and then you would dip the next one and so on down the line until you got to the end. By the time you got to the last candle paddle, the first one should be cool enough to start again, and you could repeat the process. In this way, you could dip 100 or a couple hundred candles within the span of about an hour or two, and so the process would take a little bit less time. Don't get me wrong, it could still take you a day or two to finish everything, but it did help speed the process up. So now that we've learned a little bit about the history of candles here, let's talk about how to make them. You can use something as simple as a little bit of candle wick. Now, this is something that you can buy online, or you can use other fibrous materials twisted together if you want a more old-fashioned type of candle. this is by no means how people back then would have been doing it. As I mentioned, they would be doing it over a pot over an open fire with boiling wax. Well, as you can clearly see in front of me, this is not boiling. What I have in front of me is a small deep fryer. We put it on the lowest setting possible because all we're looking for is to just melt the wax. Now, actually in here, we actually have about this much water and only about this much wax at the top. And generally what we do is we start off by handing everyone a small wick and saying, this is your candle. But I also have a small knot tied towards the top. It's just a simple knot. Now, normally what I do with this is that's your stopping point. This allows you to hold the candle wick above the knot, allows you to dip up to the knot, make your candle below that, and never have your fingers in the wax. Now, this is going to take a process between doing this and then dipping it in some cool water, which I have here in this metal bucket. But again, remember, you do have something that is very hot, so please be cautious and please only do this with adult supervision. When we're making our candles, what I generally like to do is tell everyone that you want to dip it down into the wax, bring it up. So dip one, back up on two, and then drip, drip, drip. This is going to allow excess wax to drip off before you move it over to the water bucket and will avoid a lot of messy cleanup later. Now, I'm actually going to start with one I've already been working on because I've already dipped it a couple of times, so it won't be quite as twisted. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to dip this down into the candle pot. And so, as I said, dip, up, drip, drip, drip. Now, once I've done that, I'll dip it in the cool water bucket. If I need to straighten it, which you might from time to time, it shouldn't be too hard. Don't pull on it too much. You don't want to break it or crack it, but you can shape it slightly and then go ahead and dip it again. Dip, up, drip, drip, drip. Now again, you can dip it in the cool water bucket and again, straighten it out. After so many layers, you won't have to worry about this anymore. It'll start to hold its shape. In fact, I have one that's a little further along, and this one we have probably close to 10 to 12 dips on here. So it's been going for a while. And as you can see, it'll hold its shape a lot easier. Now when I bring that one out, dip, up, drip, 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 into the cold water bucket, and back over here, and then back to the candle pot again. Dip, up, drip, drip, drip. Now, you might notice as well, cool that off for a moment, that there is a little bit of an excess tail building on here. Now, some people like to leave that, and you can if you'd like. However, if you continuously dip your candles for a while, you might end up with a very, very, very long tail. And this is going to make it hard to fit into a candle holder. It's also going to be wax that really will probably never melt very well as you burn your candle down. So every so often, every 10 or so dips, I like to trim the bottom just a little bit. And what this is going to help you do is help you have a nice rounded shape traditionally that you would see in candles along the bottom as you dip. So again, dip, up, drip, drip, drip. Now when we do our activities, we usually do between 25 and 30 dips. By that point, your candle will look something probably closer to this. It's a little bigger than, say, a birthday candle, but it's a very nice sized candle for something like this at home. And this is something that we normally let our participants in our programs take home with them. So if you're doing this, dip, up, drip, drip, drip. Now let's say this was your last dip. Now what we want to do now is some of this candle will still be a little bit warm. Even though it's not completely soft wax, it's still going to be cooler. So what I normally tell everyone to do is go over to a cool water bucket, hold it in there, and this time count really slowly to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now that candle's going to be cooled off enough that you can hold it up, and now you have a finished candle for a little project. But if you'd like it to last just a little bit longer, a good idea is to keep it in the freezer. Now you might think that seems strange, but if you think about it, since the wax and the wick are going to be near frozen, it's going to take them longer to thaw as they're burning down, which will make the candle last just a bit longer. But remember, each one of these is dipped uniquely, so it means each one of them are going to look slightly different. That's one of the neat things about hand-dipped candles. Now, talking about a 50 to 60 dip candle, this is not quite as long as they would have made. These are a little bit shorter, but a candle of about this size is what we're talking about 50 to 60 dips. You might also notice that there's a little bit of coloring in this particular wax, and that's because this came from a batch that we had put a little bit of green dye in there. You can put dyes and scents in your candles as well. Have fun with it, that's part of the point. Now, if you don't have something like this, and you don't want to do it over an open fire, which again can be quite dangerous, what you might do is you might actually boil a little bit of wax over a very deep pot over the stove. Again, put it on the very lowest setting, because again, we don't really need this to be boiling, we just need the wax to be melted. And once it is, we will actually be able to dip candles. But now you know at least the basic process of dipping candles, and now you know a little bit about the history of it. There's so much more to do and so much more to learn and so much more to investigate. So if you're interested, you can go online and find even more stuff. There are wonderful sites across the country that do this, and we do it here at Jackson's Mill during some of our school programs and camps throughout the year if you'd like to come and be a part of it here. But I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope that you learned some stuff, and I hope that you give this a try as well.